This morning is Epiphany Sunday. I don't think we've made much of a point of that to date, but Epiphany falls on January 6th, and so we celebrate the closest Sunday to the 6th as Epiphany Sunday. And it's a time in the liturgical calendar when we recognize, we celebrate the manifestation or appearance of Jesus to the world, particularly as we remember the coming of the Magi to Bethlehem. You see, on Christmas, we celebrated his birth intimately, in private, in secret even. But here on Epiphany, we recognize that even before his miraculous ministries and his horrific death, from his earliest days, Jesus' life had an immediate impact on global events. The Magi, the wise men from the east, had read the night sky and seeing a new star appear began to follow its course. And in contradiction to most of the creches and nativity scenes that we put on display throughout December, the Magi were not yet present at Jesus' birth. Actually, just check, we're guilty of this. They're right here. They've been up all December. Who knew that the Magi weren't there at the time of Jesus' birth? We got a couple tentative hands. You see, rather, it's precisely at this moment that we depict here that the star first appeared, the star that they saw. And so it's at Jesus' birth, actually, that the wise men begin their journey out of the east. They haven't arrived yet. They're actually just beginning their long journey. And it was long. Most biblical scholars agree that Jesus was between 1 and 2 years old by the time that the Magi arrived. Think about that. They started their journey when the star appeared in the sky, and by the time they actually made it to Bethlehem, he was 1 to 2 years old. They didn't have airplanes or trains or cars back then. It took a while to get places. It took a lot of commitment to keep that journey going. But this is an important point that we'll return to shortly. Jesus was 1 or 2 years old by the time that the Magi arrived. Now, setting aside the timeline for a moment, the participation of the Magi in this extended birth narrative evokes or implies several crucial theological points for our faith. First, it suggests that the significance of Jesus' birth was evident not only through the special and particular witness God granted to the Hebrew people through the prophets, as was recorded in the Torah. Rather, anyone, anywhere, with the appropriate discernment could tell that something of cosmic significance had taken place. The entirety of the night sky had literally changed overnight. And inquiring minds of any ethnic or religious origin could have put the pieces together. That's what we're being told. But this immediately leads to the second crucial theological point, that from the very beginning of the story, not just the end of the story, but from the very beginning of the story, there were non-Jewish Gentile peoples who were involved, who could clearly recognize that Jesus was the Messiah, even when other people, even when Israel itself was in the midst of rejecting him. Gentiles were involved from the very beginning. It's as if God knew that St. Matthew was going to be struggling with this exact problem of Jewish-Gentile conflict in the early church when he wrote his gospel. A problem that must not have been so pressing for Mark, Luke, or John, as they did not include the wise men in their accounts. These Magi only show up in the Gospel of Matthew. But nevertheless, John, whose writings we've heard this morning, which was the latest gospel to be written, his prose sets the mundane aside in favor of this beautiful, sweeping, even more cosmic vision. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of the blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. It's actually the same theological point that Matthew is making, just without the Magi. That Jesus' own people did not accept him, while those Gentiles who believed in his name were adopted as children of God. And so this symmetry will come through as we continue, but in both cases, both Gospels are making a point that things that will be important later in the story are already pre-existing. They're already present at the beginning of the story. But I prefer, for now, at least today, the narrative format in Matthew. Why? Because it's messier. I love a mess. John's transcendent, beautiful account leaves out all but the barest hint of drama. But in Matthew's story, the Magi, on that long, tiring, years-long trip, well, as they got close to the end, they decided to stop off by Jerusalem to see good old Herod, King Herod, en route to their destination. And why wouldn't they? In their innocence or naivete, they assumed that King Herod would be equally interested in finding, honoring, and even worshiping this newborn Messiah. Well, he wasn't. Because Herod perceived Jesus to be a threat to his political power. Someone who, in the future, once he was grown, the people might rally around to dethrone Herod, to cast him down, to replace him. So, in his cunning, Herod plies the Magi for more information. He already knew some things. From his scribes, he'd already learned that according to the scriptures, the preordained location of the Messiah's birth was to be Bethlehem. That's what the prophet Micah had proclaimed. But he was still missing some important information. And it was from the Magi that he captured this critical time when the star had appeared, roughly 1 or 2 years prior. And with these 2 points of information, Herod had a target, a time and a place. So he put a smile on and deceitfully sent the Magi along. Go see him, and then come back and let me know where he is. And they were none the wiser about this critical intelligence that they had revealed to him. But thankfully, after finding the young Jesus, after completing our nativity scene, they were warned in a dream to depart Israel without returning to Jerusalem, to go home by another road. And so too, Joseph, the father of Jesus, was also warned in a dream to gather up his own family and flee the country. And so it was, Matthew tells us, that when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he was infuriated. And you know how this part of the story goes. He was infuriated. And so he sent for and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the Magi. That part of the story is why it's important for us to remember that the Magi weren't there at Jesus' birth. It was only later, when he was 1 or 2 years old that they arrived, and because of that imprecision, because of that long journey, and because they stopped off to check in with a king who should have been on their side, through no intentional fault of their own, while they, the Magi, paid homage to Christ, Herod was back in Jerusalem making plans to execute all of the children that might have been born between the time that they left the east and arrived at the manger. To someone like him, to someone like Herod, what does it matter? Better to kill 100 innocents than risk one threat to his power. What does this imprecision matter? So long as in the dragnet of death, Herod is able to catch up this young Messiah within it as well. You see, the stakes are higher here in Matthew's account. It's a little bit more difficult than John's simple, yet the world did not know him. Matthew's story has teeth. And rightly so, because of course, to the ears of Matthew's audience, this horrific event evokes precisely the events of the Passover, if in a different, reverse order. Matthew is deliberately evoking the Exodus here. Jesus as a new Moses, Herod as a new Pharaoh, the flight to Egypt and the return, which establishes Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel's story of liberation from tyranny, or even more specifically, liberation from empire. And let's be clear about what that means. Empire isn't just any old form of government or authority. Empire is a logic of power that believes it can offer salvation through violence and control. Empire is a logic of power that purports to offer salvation, but it does it through violence and by superimposing control. That is inherently, essentially what empires do. Pharaoh did it, Herod did it, the Roman Empire did it, all of which is the context for all of our biblical stories. And all of these empires in every age follow the same pattern: identify threats, eliminate them, maintain order by force. They demonstrate a logic in which power protects itself, where law is enforced by violence and security is purchased through the blood of the vulnerable, like those young children in Bethlehem. An empire always says that it believes that it is bringing order, restoring stability, and protecting what matters. It purports to be doing everyone a service. It always justifies itself in the name of something greater, transcendent ideals, like law and order. No matter how divorced from the truth this rhetoric may be in actuality on the ground. But this child, this young Messiah, this Jesus, who escaped from Herod's sword only through the warning of God, only through the angel that visited in the dreams of his father, the dreams of the Magi, he grew up to reveal a very different way to be in the world. Listen again how John, the author of the gospel, describes what exactly it is that came into the world in this moment. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. The law, indeed, was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Grace upon grace. Not power upon power not violence upon violence. And by the end of his life, the one who we follow stood as the ultimate counter-imperial presence, the ultimate counter-example to what these empire figures like Pharaoh and Herod and Caesar stood for. He chose vulnerability over domination throughout the entirety of his ministry. And at the very end, he chose to be broken rather than to sacrifice others. That's the essence of the gospel, that he in fact chose to willingly die at the hands of this Roman Empire, so that others, the thief on the cross next to him, undeserving, just as undeserving as the rest of us, he chose to willingly die on a cross so that the weak, the vulnerable, the impoverished might be lifted up and embraced as children of God. And that is precisely what that gospel passage from John says. So this morning, this Epiphany Sunday, that is also Communion Sunday, we celebrate, we remember this man, this Christ child who also found the fullness of his ministry on a Roman cross. We come this morning to a table, not a throne, not a palace, not a seat of power, but a simple meal shared by a community that confesses we cannot save ourselves. And we come simply as recipients, not as conquerors, not as purported saviors ourselves. We come acknowledging our need for grace upon grace, knowing that the way of law and power, when divorced from grace and mercy, only leads to ever more death. That is, again, the essence of the gospel. We have been saved from the law. At this table, we come to meet the one who fled empire as a refugee, who died as empire's victim, and whose presence we still encounter here, offering us too another way home. May it be so. Amen.